name is Greg Brzezinski. I am the director of the Seeger Center for Asian Studies, as well as the director of the Asian Studies program here at the George Washington University. I'd like to welcome our audience. Unfortunately, Professor Mike Mochizuki won't be able to join us today. He hasn't been feeling well, but I will be moderating the panel instead. And I think this is a panel that I've, of course, been very much looking forward to. We all know Shinzo Abe, former Prime Minister of Japan, has a sort of a complicated legacy that people see very differently depending on their political perspective, the country that they're from, and a variety of other factors. And so we've put together a very distinguished group of panelists to address this question today. Let me introduce our panelists. They'll each speak for about 15 minutes, and after that I will open the floor to Q&A. If you are called on, one of our assistants will bring a microphone to you. Please introduce yourself. Let me first introduce Tobias Harris, who will speak first. He is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, where he oversees the national security and international policy team's work on Asia. From 2013 to 2021, he was a political risk analyst covering Japan and the Korean Peninsula at Teneo Technologies, as well as a research fellow for economy, trade, and business at the Sasakawa Peace Foundation USA from 2014 to 2020. He is the author of The Iconoclast, Shinzo Abe and the New Japan, the first English language biography of Japan's longest-serving prime minister. Our second panelist, Kuniko Ashizawa, teaches international relations and serves as Japan coordinator of the Asian Studies Research Council at the School of International Service at American University. She also teaches a number of courses here at the Elliott School, which are very popular. From 2005 until 2012, she was a senior lecturer in international relations at Oxford Brookes University in the UK. Her research interests have included Japan's foreign security and development assistance policy, U.S.-Japan-China relations, regional institution building in Asia, and the role of the concept of state identity in foreign policy making, about which she has published in a number of academic journals and book chapters, including International Studies Review, Pacific Affairs, and the Pacific Review. Our final panelist, Nathan Park, is a litigator who has handled every type of complex financial litigation, including cross-border matters involving securities and derivatives. He often represents Korea-based clients in connection with regulatory investigations involving U.S. and local authorities. He has experience with international judgment enforcement and international arbitration, and also you may know him as well from his extensive op-ed writing about Asia's economy and politics. His work has appeared in such venues as the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, and The Atlantic. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. And I'll turn it over to Tobias.
Thank you, Greg, for the introduction. Thank you to the Elliott School. It's really great to be here. Good to see some friends in the crowd. Good to be doing an in-person event, not just from my basement. Of course, this is a perfectly timed opportunity to have this discussion. And of course, it seems that this has been sort of an ongoing discussion now for months since the late Prime Minister Abe was assassinated in July. And I'm going to dive right into it, and I want to pick up just from something that Greg said in his remarks, and that is this idea of Abe having a mixed legacy. And that, I think, is absolutely true, and all you have to do is look at the response of the Japanese public to this idea that we were going to have a state-funded funeral ceremony for him this week. I mean, clearly, he was someone who, throughout his career, was divisive, controversial, someone who I think you could say inspired passionate feelings on all sides, that I think his supporters were quite zealous in their support for him. I remember being at campaign rallies they did in 2017, and you know, some of the people in those crowds were there because the LDP machine bussed them in, but many of those people were there because they were Abe's people. They supported him, they believed in him, they shared his vision, and those people, you know, so his support, he did have, I think, a pretty firm base of support, but I think as we've seen this week, he was also someone who inspired some pretty passionate opposition from people, and I'll get into why, but you know, that really shouldn't be overlooked. I think, and sometimes, you know, if you look only at kind of the appreciations that came in from world leaders, it provided an incomplete picture, I think, of Abe the politician. You know, this is a politician who, you know, by his own reckoning, I mean, and I think that's the important thing to stress. This is not someone who was confused as to why people might have disagreed with him. I mean, he was someone who could read his own writings. You know, he was someone who thought the highest measure, the highest ideal a politician should aim for was being, you know, a politician who articulated what he wanted, pursued that, and did not shy away from criticism, you know, pressed on regardless of what people said and what the media said and what opposition politicians said. And so this was, you know, very much baked into his identity as a politician. It was kind of a role he assumed he was going to play, and so we shouldn't be surprised by that, and we should definitely keep that in mind as sort of a balance to some of the praise from world leaders that came in, because clearly this is a figure who was more competent. You know, clearly he was a global statesman, and there were times where he was capable of playing that. But at home, he was a fiercely combative politician and political leader, and we shouldn't forget that. So when we think about kind of this mixed legacy and what it means and why we should look at his legacy as mixed, I think we have to look at it from two different perspectives. And first, I want to start by talking about his long-term legacy, and that is looking at not just at the 8 years, or you know, the nearly 8 years of his second premiership, the more successful of his two premierships, but really the arc of his 30-year career, and what it really meant. You know, this was he enters politics in 1993, having inherited his father. His father had passed away 2 years prior, and this is a very ambitious politician from the beginning. You know, he is elected at this moment of great uncertainty in Japanese politics. The Cold War had ended, the bubble economy had burst, and Japan's post-war economic model was basically discredited. The LDP lost power for the first time briefly from 1993 to 1994. And in fact, Abe, elected in 1993, starts his political career as an opposition politician with not really a whole lot to do. But he is part of elected sort of as part of this young generation of what I call in my book is new conservatives, people who maybe pick up ideas that have been sort of around the so-called anti-mainstream in the LDP for most of the Cold War, but now they see a window of opportunity opening up. And all of a sudden, you know, there's fluidity in politics. There's questions about Japan's place in the world. There's questions about Japan's economy and how Japan was going to grow in the future. And I think what you have to recognize is that for these politicians, these sort of young conservatives, they saw an opportunity open up to resolve really the Cold War, the cultural Cold War that Japan had experienced basically since 1945 or 1952, to resolve it in their favor. And I just want to briefly discuss that, just so we're clear on what I'm talking about. Basically, that if you look at what the U.S. occupation did after 1945, the first couple of years, you had this pursuit of democracy, democratization and demilitarization. And this created more space for organized labor, for parties on the left, for a more robust free press. Of course, this, you can also consider educational reform as part of this, but basically opening up the space for liberal and further left elements in Japanese society that had been suppressed under the militarist government. And of course, that raised hopes. There were optimism that this might open up Japan in a more liberal and democratic direction. At the same time, of course, a number of wartime leaders found themselves, including Abe's grandfather, Kishi Nobusuke, found themselves imprisoned as war criminals. A number of them were executed as war criminals. And so that certainly opened up, it seemed to be opening up space for a different kind of Japan. Then, of course, we have the notorious reverse course in 1947, 1948, where all of a sudden, the Truman administration wakes up and realizes that Japan needs to be is needed as a bulwark to contain the Soviet Union in Asia, and all of those purged pre-war, wartime leaders find their way back into political life eventually, and taking different paths to get there again, including Abe's grandfather. And so you end up with this situation where enough space had been created for these more progressive forces. They were part of Japanese life. You had parties that were involved. Of course, you briefly had a socialist prime minister during this period. But then, of course, you also had more right-wing elements back in the fray. And so the transformation was incomplete. And you ended up with this uneasy balance. And you did end up with a consensus forged under Prime Minister Yoshida that in some ways contained the right wing probably more than the left wing. That yes, of course, the socialists were sort of a opposition for much of the Cold War, but in practice they were actually consulted for a lot of policy, certainly during the heyday of the LDP's golden age of rule. And Yoshida, he was not necessarily happy about the Constitution, but he accepted it, pushed back against attempts to revise it, was lambasted for accepting subordinate and a subordinate relationship with the United States. And so all of this settlement was in place, and the right wing hated it and pushed against it and tried to change it, but was largely unsuccessful during the course of the Cold War. So of course, bring it back to the 90s, so you have these young politicians like Abe, who see the opportunity to finally resolve this, to remove some of the restrictions, most notably the Constitution that were placed on Japan at the end of the war, preventing it from being a great power, that Japan would be able to step into the sun again as a great power. And that was, I think, fundamentally what this group wanted to achieve. And so when we look at the 30-year arc or so of Abe's career, in large part he was successful in that. And he wasn't alone in this. And a number of reformers in the 90s, including Abe's eventual nemesis, Ozawa Ichiro, were instrumental in this. They reformed the political system, particularly the electoral system. They changed some dramatic administrative reforms that increased the power of politicians over the bureaucracy and centered power in the Prime Minister's office. You ended up with a much more ideologically coherent right-wing LDP compared to what it had been during the Cold War, which was a much more mixed party, a much more top-down, leader-dominated LDP. And all of that made for a Japanese state and a Japanese government that were just fundamentally different than how it was at the start of Abe's career. And again, Abe wasn't alone in this, but I think what ended up happening, certainly by virtue of having been in power as long as he did, he showed truly what it meant, what these reforms actually meant. That when you had sort of prime ministers changing year in, year out, it was hard to ever really get a sense of how the new system worked. Abe, after 8 years, showed this actually is a change system. This is a system that is much more coherent, much more top-down, much more decisive, particularly in areas of national security where you now have a National Security Council and Secretariat, which was one of Abe's reforms. You also have greater political control of the bureaucracy, again, another one of Abe's reforms, creating a cabinet personnel bureau. In the couple minutes I have left, though, I want to talk about his policy legacy, though, which is, I think, admittedly more mixed. And you wouldn't necessarily get that sense, from some of the tributes to him. I'll just talking about foreign policy. I mean, he was a tremendously activist foreign policy prime minister. I think, we could look at the numbers, the foreign trips he took, the number of summits, the relationships he forged with foreign leaders. All of that, I think, was important. And if we're actually really both in foreign policy and economic policy, I think the way to think about his foreign policy legacy, or his policy legacy on the whole, is that he really has made it so that there is no alternative. That he showed that the choices available actually to his successors when it comes to kind of imagining alternate ways of conducting Japan's policy are actually quite limited. Let's start in foreign policy. We can think about with your relationship with the United States. Yes, Japan has had a long-standing relationship with the United States. The alliance has been very important. Abe's investment, though, the core of Abe's foreign policy, though, is recognizing that actually in an Asia where China is as strong as it is, there is no alternative to keeping the United States in the region. That the second best and the third best alternatives are so poor that they might as well not be alternatives at all. And so basically that led to a determination on Abe's part to do whatever it took to keep the United States engaged in the region. That meant, really at the time, a quite controversial decision to bring Japan into TPP. I mean, his party had ran on a platform opposing TPP, and then 2 or 3 months later, he had decided to bring Japan in. It was, taking, I think, a number of political risks on the 2013 state secrecy laws, really investing in a lot of political capital and getting a new interpretation of collective self-defense and the legal changes to accompany that. Of course, we can also look at his relationship with Donald Trump, and Abe himself has said that that was more realpolitik and then committed about keeping the U.S. in the region than it was about being best buddies with him. All of that was fundamental to this. But the other parts of his foreign policy was just relationship building, both with partners in the region, India and Australia maybe being the most important ones, also in Southeast Asia, but also I think Europe, and there's really been a sustained effort to bring Europe into the region and to strengthen ties with Europe. Notably, of course, he had some very striking foreign policy failures. I think his attempts to improve relations with China were probably too little too late. I'm sure we're going to talk a lot more about the mishandling, I think, the fundamental mistakes he made in relations with South Korea. Relations with North Korea went nowhere. His Russia diplomacy went nowhere. I mean, all of that, I think were notable failures. And places where he spent a lot of effort, at least in the case of Russia, very little to show for it. Very quickly on the econ side, of course, Abe, most known, maybe became a household name because of Abenomics, this really quite ambitious program to revitalize Japan's economy. Again, the results are very mixed. Again, and really, the fact that there is no alternative seems to describe it better than that this was such a roaring success. The Bank of Japan, of course, seems to have no alternative but to keep ultra low interest rates and to continue buying large amounts of bonds. But it seems like it's more because they can't find a way out than because it's necessarily been so effective at producing the kind of inflation that they want. In fact, they're finding now in a situation of the cost push inflation that they don't want, and trying to figure out how to manage that. In fiscal policy, I think we need to think about what he actually did in fiscal policy. There was a kind of stop-start where you had stimulus, and then they raised the consumption tax, and then it slowed the economy down. But I think the most important legacy, and again, this is in terms of changing the terms of debate as much as it was about the actual economic outcomes of what he did. Look, the LDP today is a party that is much more comfortable with large amounts of fiscal stimulus than it was when he took control of the party. This is, in the months before Abe was assassinated, the issue that he was hammering home on was that we have a lot more room, we don't have to worry about deficits, and of course it was linked to raising defense spending, let's not forget that. But the LDP had become a party that was much more comfortable with arguments like that, is much more comfortable with arguments than that. The LDP that Abe inherited or took over in 2012 was a party that was proud to have campaigned on tax hikes. That is not the LDP of today. And that, I think, is a pretty significant change. The final part of Abenomics was a search for a growth strategy, the so-called third arrow, which ended up kind of throwing lots of ideas against the wall. Some were more successful than others. Trade was part of that, so his pursuit of reviving TPP after the U.S. pulled out in 2017, an economic partnership agreement with the European Union, all of that was part of that. But this idea that you really had a fundamental shift to a new growth model, I think Abe definitely fell short on that front. I think both Suga and Kishida, his successors, have been looking for an answer to that, looking at the green transformation that Kishida is calling it, or digitization. I mean, they're still searching. But again, I think what we have to look at here is not necessarily the policy outcomes, but changing how business is done. And what you do have is, I think, under Abe, you get a shift to a much more state-led development model. The idea that to compete in a more, just a more fiercely competitive global economy, and certainly a more competitive regional economy, that the Japanese state needs to be much more involved in shifting capital, human capital into areas of growth, finding those new growth sectors. And frankly, under the Kishida government, we're seeing a much more explicit commitment to investing and subsidizing activities in these growth sectors. And so that, I think, is a reflection of Abe's change as well. It's not that he solved the problem of Japan's long-term growth, but he, I think, has carved out a new approach that I think his successors are going to be pretty much bound by. The last thing I will say, mindful of time, then I think we have to think also about these missed opportunities, that for all of these achievements, there were real missed opportunities, I think, in relations with South Korea, for example. I think maybe in 10 or 15 years, the biggest missed opportunities might be on climate. He was probably the strongest leader in the G7 for a big part of his tenure. He certainly had opportunities, particularly after the Paris Climate Accord, to make Japan, I think, a real, genuine leader. Could have done Abenomics 3.0, Japan's Green New Deal, and he didn't. And that, we're seeing that more now under Suga, under Kishida. But that was a missed opportunity. There were missed years where I think he could have used his power to really shift things in that direction. And ultimately, I think he was really unable to take on the vested interests that I think stood in the way of that happening. And the final thing I'll note, and I think if you look at the reaction to his funeral, even as he shifted Japan's state to a new model, really changed Japanese politics and how the government works in fundamental ways, he did not do what Yoshida did, which is really create a durable consensus. I think he did not bring the Japanese public along with him. The public was attached to a lot of these post-war institutions that he was trying to change, and the fact that he remains controversial even in death is a sign of just how little he succeeded at really bringing the public along in a major way. So these changes are real. I think they're durable. It's up to his successors to really make their presence felt and really bring the public along with them. I mean, it's hard to see Japan going back, but the new model is going to, really is going to take some work for leaders to win more popular legitimacy for this new model. So I'm going to stop there. Look forward to hearing my other panelists.
Thank you. So what's
Okay,
next to
so
Would you prefer to use the podium?
Yes,
That's fine.
I don't think I can.
No, you can use the mic or
No,
the
I
podium,
can
whatever you
change
like.
the
Yes.
PowerPoint. Yes, I don't have
Okay.
a remote for the PowerPoint.
You should be able to use the mouse. Sorry about that. I didn't know you had a PowerPoint.
Yeah, I just made it this morning.
That's why we
I just thought maybe it's better to have a little bit visual aid for my talk.
Okay. Is there a remote there?
I think they can use this. Yeah. And also, I'll be
They make us bring our own, so but let's
Stop and share. Make sure I'm sharing the right screen. Okay, there we go. It's important.
And just like them talking into this microphone.
Yes.
Yeah, this one.
Thank you. So the Tobias really kind of made a really good overview of the former Prime Minister Abe's legacy, and of course he can do it because he published a wonderful book and a really timely book on Abe. So the former Prime Minister Abe. So it was kind of good kind of way to start even for my kind of really narrowly focused discussion, because I was a little bit amazed to see there's some similar message I was going to make with my case, which is Abe, womenomics, and then gender equality in Japan. As Greg kindly introduced me, I'm more kind of focusing, I'm having more kind of focusing on the Japanese foreign policy and the US foreign policy vis-a-vis the regional organization, regional cooperation. But this kind of gender issues, it's kind of my new research interest, and I'm teaching Women in Asia course at the GW Elliott School this semester. So I just take this advantage to just focus on these particular issues for this semester's teaching. So definitely my focus is very narrow, and to think about what kind of legacy the former Prime Minister Abe might have made for the issue of women's, and then particular, and also the gender equality in Japan. Probably you have some hunch that his overall score is not necessarily good when it comes to the gender equality. But the day after Prime Minister was shot, Hillary Clinton tweeted, and she said he was a champion of democracy and then of women's potential. So that was her tweet the next morning. I think here Tobias already kind of referred to that the question about democracy, and probably we can discuss a little bit further of his legacy on the implication of Japanese democracy in our discussion. I'm not sure about this kind of champion things, but also she mentions the women's potential. That's going to be an interesting way to put it. So as Tobias said, maybe in an international setting, for those who did look at Japan or US-Japan relationship, might also have some kind of the impression that Abe did and tried to did the interesting heavy lifting for women's issues in Asia. And then of course in Japan, the term womenomics is quite kind of well advertised by the, of course, Japanese government, but also media and also some other commentators. So they became quite common terminologies in Japan. So let me just a little bit talk about what the particularly Prime Minister and former Prime Minister Abe tried to do when it comes to women's issues in Japan, and then let's see what kind of legacy, if any, that we can kind of draw on from that. The term womenomics was introduced by the Cassie Matsui. She was I think here the vice president of the Goldman Sachs in Japan, and she coined this term in 1999. So the term was already there, but Prime Minister Abe indeed picked up the language. This kind of womenomics. Interesting term, but just a little bit easy to remember. In order to kind of pursue his economic growth strategy, so this is one kind of element or measure to achieve his economic growth strategy. That's part of the so-called 3 arrow of Abenomics. And then the idea was, we need to bring more women at work because Japan had been facing this kind of labor shortage, and it was going to face more on this question of labor shortage. And so he thought bringing more women in the workplace would help or a little bit kind of accelerate maybe little jumpstart the stagnated economy. And then so this, the idea is kind of to utilize women, or to look at women as a workforce, and then primarily as an economic growth strategy. And then but it was not just a kind of a nice lip service for women. Indeed, his administration did some heavy lifting to indeed realize this idea. For instance, they introduced kind of new legislations to change some like a tax reform, tax arrangement for the household, and then also provide a good amount of financial assistance for child care, but also like a paternity leave. So there is some good heavy lifting that introduced by the Abe government. And then also in the beginning of this year, the announcement of womenomics in 2012, the Abe administration did set some numerical goal or the target to achieve this strategy. For instance, they said female labor force participation vis-a-vis that overall available female workers, right, of that age they want to bring up from the 68% of the overall women for the working age. That was in 2012 to 73% by 2020. So they got like a more clear and numerical goal to achieve these ideas. And then also there's another target: women in managemental position in large firms and private sectors also should reach the 30% of the overall kind of managemental positions by 2020. So it was kind of interesting way to visualize this idea, and also encourage the own private sectors, and then other participants in the political discourse to talk about these issues and then achieve at least getting toward that idea. And then what the exact achievement, at least for the official accounts, were made at the end of 2019 or 2020, when the Prime Minister Abe, 2020, when Prime Minister Abe stepped down. How about the first target, female labor force participation, indeed rose from 64% to 74% in 2019. So, which is actually higher than the female labor participation in this country, in the United States, which is kind of around 70%. So the additional 3.3 million women indeed joined the labor market in this particular period. Okay, that's good. How about the women's position in executive office? That was a little bit difficult. Yes, the number of the women in executive office or managerial offices did increase, but their goal was to achieve 30% of the overall kind of management positions. But in 2019, it grew, but still it was kind of around 10 to 12% of the overall kind of the management positions. So indeed, the Abe administration even changed their target goal, right? That we're going to postpone. We're going to just 2020 is not the likable kind of target to achieve. So we're going to postpone a little bit further. I think maybe another kind of decade to achieve this target. Right? So that's I would say kind of this is a kind of mixed achievement. But yeah, at least the labor kind of more women now in workplace in Japan. But in the meantime, those critics of the womenomics easily kind of pointed out there's not kind of so-called gender equalities achieved in any way in this the private sector's kind of economic arena, partly because women didn't get the higher position, which would receive more kind of higher salary, but also those 3.3 million women newly participated in the economic the market. 75% of them just got part-time job, not the kind of permanent, the proper, the full-time job, which would of course receive far much higher salary, and then also the job security too. So in the end, when you look at through the lens of the gender equalities in economic arena, still the Prime Minister Abe, that was not maybe even his idea, his goal to do that, but it was kind of hardly to say to conclude it as kind of major achievement, even not the mixed result in that case. And then interestingly, in 2019, even this year, Kashi Matsui, looking at the 5 years of the womenomics, she did admit that Japan is still a long way to achieve that women's more properly representative, in particularly the economic leadership position. But she said maybe the womenomics still helped the shift corporate managers and then also societal attitude to the critical role of gender diversity can play in driving growth. So there's a kind of things I think I can associate with what Tobias said. Maybe it's not exactly the outcome, but some kind of attitudinal shift among the business people, but also in our regular discourse on the economic development of economic growth was probably brought in by this Prime Minister's kind of initiatives on womenomics. That would lead to my other point of the Prime Minister Abe's, former Prime Minister Abe's kind of interesting impact on women's role or gender equality in society. As Tobias already pointed out, the Prime Minister Abe has been well known as a more conservative political leader to begin with. I will not go through his detailed background of that, but when it comes to the women's issues, particularly kind of promoting women's and gender equalities, before he became Prime Minister in 2006, he was really already well known as part of the leading part of so-called backlash force against that more that still relatively young feminist movement that emerged in Japan in 1990s. And so he indeed led some LDP's study group to look at the kind of gender equality study or kind of sex education, those kind of that new discourse and the new ideas that emerged from the 1990s by the more feminists or people who are working for bringing more gender equalities to, in a way, clash those ideas. And then, so it was kind of interesting that after he became the prime minister in 2006, the first administration, he already kind of introduced the new kind of educational the law, which indeed in subtle manner to kind of encourage more kind of family values, and then in a way to discourage women's rights or the idea of the women's rights or women's independence. So there's already kind of the evidence of his kind of more political activities that appear to be kind of undermining the force for the gender equalities. And then particularly for his second and third the terms in that the framework for as a kind of backlash movement toward the feminism kind of activities in Japan, he interestingly brought up or kind of uplifted several really interesting, female conservative politicians in Japanese politics. And then those are the particularly four prominent women who were definitely uplifted by the former Prime Minister Abe's really skillful political maneuver and then kind of election support, the support financially but also political support for those women to rise in the political ladder in the LDP and the Japanese politics. Those are all that diet women. And then they indeed, they don't have a really kind of single voice. I mean, one person has more kind of particular issues over others, but in general, they were associated with those conservative political organizations, including Nippon Kaigi, and then also Unification Church, which probably you might have heard a lot. And then also they were the one to promote the idea, in a way, for the family value, and in a way counter that again the feminist movement which arose in the 1990s. And then those political and conservative figures, including Prime Minister Abe, they thought it would be kind of useful to have those female voices against the kind of forcing for the gender equality. So this to me resonate with the way Prime Minister Womenomics dealt with women issues, to utilize women, right, for their other causes. And then that's what appears to be happen with the Prime Minister Abe's kind of the leadership. And then one thing that's kind of interesting to see is those women are indeed didn't come from really famous political families. I mean, in Japan, as Tobias pointed out, including Prime Minister Abe, that this kind of political pedigree is so important, right? And to become a successful politician, but even to run the office. But those women are kind of from a more kind of interesting non-political background in general, but they were able to achieve that kind of position. And then that would lead to my other kind of point. Because of the prominence of those women, and one woman even said, something like outrageous things. Women lie. Women often lie. Something like that. And so they were kind of in a way effective for pleasing and then also bringing this conservative and nationalistic cause in one part of the Japanese the political discourse, which Tobias said, getting kind of really kind of strong, right, as an Abe supporter. But in the meantime, I kind of came to know with their prominence and all other issues associated with womenomics, but also some scandal, gender-related scandal, which was kind of became really kind of prevalent in the Abe administration. I started seeing that there's some the relatively young, but also old. Some quarter of the Japanese women finally kind of speaking up. So there's a kind of a little bit sign of that another backlash to the backlash. And then again, it's relatively small because Japan in general is a really conservative society, so it's not hard for them to really speak up. But some women, particularly young ones, start kind of even creating their kind of civil society organization to call for that like a gender quota in the Japanese diet. And then some groups, some women start creating an organization to provide support for young or maybe not necessarily young, but female kind of the candidates to run, not just for the national diet, but also the local government. So this is, okay, this is not surprising, right, in the US context, but in Japan, that kind of initiatives, movement among women are still really new to me. So this would turn to me, let me to really think about. It's of course hard to conclude at this moment how kind of vibrant or how important, significant this new kind of voices of counter, the backlash to backlash voices is going to unfold in Japanese politics. But if that happened, I think that appears to be probably the one way that how the Prime Minister Abe's policies and then action change brought about the kind of new attitudinal change in at least one quarter of the Japanese society. And then, of course, that would probably lead to that more kind of contentious the situation between the conservative forces and then also these kind of new voices. But obviously, that would be probably considered as a so the attitudinal shift among Japanese political discourse and society, which may be later on interpreted as a potential legacy of former Prime Minister Abe. Okay? So that's my conclusion for this short remarks, and then I'll stop here.
Thank you.
So I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'll just stay in my seat. Hello everyone, my name is Nathan Park. Thank you, Professor Brzezinski, for inviting me. It's an honor to be here with these distinguished panelists. I especially owe a debt of gratitude to Tobias. Thanks to his excellent book, the types of folks who would attend this talk would do well to buy his book, the biography of Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. That's quite comprehensive, extremely helpful in filling some of the gaps in knowledge that I had. Just a quick introduction to myself. My affiliation obligations require me to say that I am also a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute as well as the Central Institute based in Seoul. By day, I am an international litigator practicing in international trade law, but I also write quite frequently, which is I was invited here to speak specifically about Prime Minister Abe Shinzo's relationship with the Korean Peninsula. And I think it's an important topic for several reasons. First, for an obvious reason that Korea is the nearest neighbor to Japan and has a great deal of implications for Japan's foreign policy. But at the same time, I also think that it is quite important in the sense that Abe's relationship with Korea, both North and South, gives an insight as to how we should be thinking about Abe's legacy, and in both in foreign policy as well as domestic policy, and also insight as to how we, Americans, I presume most of us are Americans here, ought to be thinking about his legacy in assessing. So let me go over 3 points. I'm going to talk about North Korea, I'm going to talk about South Korea, and then the insights that we gained from that. So let's first orient ourselves with how things were between Japan and North Korea as of around early 2000, mid-2000. And I pegged that point because that's when Abe Shinzo, the politician, becomes rises from being a junior lawmaker towards a prominence as a credible prime minister candidate, and ultimately the prime minister in 2006 for Larry Republic, and then comes back. So North Korea surprised a lot of people, maybe not this crowd, but surprised a lot of people when I tell people that Japan, not too long ago, was a very important gateway for North Korea, connecting it to the world. And that's because of the historical circumstances. As you know, Korea previously was Japan's colony, which meant that many Koreans, as many as 2 million Koreans, were living in Japan during the colonial times. And even after liberation, between 500,000 to 600,000 ethnic Koreans remained in Japan to live. And when they left their home country, it was one. And they were seeing the division from outside of the peninsula, not directly affected by the war. And the ethnic Koreans in Japan ended up having quite a different perspective and attitude towards the division of Korea, even compared to Koreans living in Korea. That ended up meaning that lots of these ethnic Koreans living in Japan ended up becoming a bridge between North Korea and the outside world. And they were subject to a largely benign neglect by the Japanese government that is formally a partner of the free world. So as recently as 2000, these are some statistics that surprises me even though I know this. Whenever I'm reminded of this, I'm surprised again. As of 2000, North Korea's leading trade partner in the world was Japan. Over 30% of North Korea's trade was with Japan. Until 2002, there was a direct flight from Pyongyang to Nagoya every day. Prime Minister Koizumi Junichiro visited Pyongyang twice. That's more often than President Moon Jae-in visited Pyongyang. And each time Prime Minister Koizumi visited Pyongyang, he met with Kim Jong-il and had very substantive discussions in advancing the two countries' relationship. I don't want to paint too rosy a picture. Clearly, North Korea was an isolated and authoritarian, totalitarian government, no less brutal than it is now. But I also don't want to minimize it either, that the relationship between Japan and North Korea was substantial. Now we come to the mid-2000s time period. Abe Shinzo, one of the issues that made him a prominent national figure is a focus on North Korea's abduction of Japanese citizens. Many of us know North Korea had abducted as many as 17 Japanese citizens to turn them into language teachers for their spies. North Korean spies often assumed and basically stole the Japanese citizens' identities to travel around the world. And Prime Minister Abe, before he was Prime Minister, he focused very strongly on this issue to gain national prominence, which also had the effect of chilling the activities of the ethnic Koreans who were living in Japan being associated with North Korea as they came to official and unofficial scrutiny by the Japanese government and society. And then when North Korea began its nuclear program, Japan was a very active participant in the international sanctions regime. So over the course of Abe Shinzo's prominence, topped with his 8 years of premiership. Japan's 30% share with North Korea in trade went basically to zero. And the relationship between Japan and North Korea as of this moment is virtually non-existent. And this had a significant implication in the room for Japan to act within in addressing North Korean issues. Back in late 20th century, so it's late 1990s to early 2000s, was also the time when South Korea was very meaningfully engaging North Korea through President Kim Dae-jung's Sunshine Policy. At the time, as you can glean from Prime Minister Koizumi's Pyongyang visit, at the time, Japan was a very meaningful participant in those dialogues. Japan was a participant, for example, in the six-party talks that froze North Korea's nuclear program for quite some time. Compare that to the recent round of inter-Korean relationships and activity that happened in the time period 2017, 18, 19 under President Donald Trump and President Moon Jae-in. At that point, Japan was largely watching from the sidelines because it no longer had any leverage point. It's simply the case that in order for any sort of sanctions to work, you need to have some kind of trade first. Otherwise, there's no point in sanctioning anything if you're not trading. So that has been Abe Shinzo's legacy as to North Korea, where his hard line ended up reducing Japan's space to maneuver in the world, as far as dealing with North Korea. Second point, as to South Korea. Let's again orient ourselves in the time period of mid-2000s or so. The high point of South Korea-Japan relationship, a lot of people point to 1998, when President Kim Dae-jung visited Tokyo and issued a joint declaration with Prime Minister Obuchi Geisel in what's called the Kim-Obuchi Declaration of Friendship. And since then, the two countries' relationship went to a new height. There was, from South Korean end, there was a greater acceptance of Japanese pop culture, more tourism, both inbound and outbound, and more economic exchanges. From Japan's end, there was greater recognition of greater recognition of the historical issues that have afflicted the two countries. There was this timeline is slightly off, but the Kono statement that recognized Japan's culpability in comfort women, the military sex slaves, was issued in 1993, and from that point on, there was meaningful progress in the Japanese society's reckoning with the crimes of Imperial Japan and its colonialism. And this, again, took a sharp turn to the other direction as Abe Shinzo rose to prominence. Prime Minister Abe's historical revisionism is a well-trodden topic. I don't have to go over it very much in detail. Just a couple of highlights. He repeatedly flirted with the idea of retracting the Kono statement until very strong international pressure pushed him otherwise. He deserves credit for entering into an agreement attempting to address the comfort women issue in 2015 with the Park Geun-hye administration in South Korea. But that agreement was marred by the fact that it was largely a backroom negotiation, did not involve the former military sex slaves themselves, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them ended up finding out about the agreement from the news, that their lifetime project had been agreed to, basically superseded by the top diplomats of two countries, which led to essentially the evisceration of that agreement in the following Moon Jae-in administration. Abe's reaction to that perhaps was, in my view, the worst transgression in the Japan-South Korea relationship since its normalization in 1965. The reaction to that, it wasn't, by the way, I must add that it wasn't just about the comfort women issue, it was also about the forced labor issue. The Koreans who were subjected to essentially slave labor during World War II at Japanese mines and war fields operated by Japanese corporations assisting the war effort. They have successfully sued those Japanese companies in the South Korean courts and won, and they were on the verge of beginning to execute their judgment upon the assets of the Japanese corporation. It's still that case, that execution of that judgment is still pending currently. Reacting to these developments, Abe Shinzo began a trade war against South Korea, essentially attempting to kneecap South Korea's semiconductor industry. He did so by essentially putting an embargo, that might be too strong of a term, but significant export control on the Japanese companies that produce high-tech materials that serve as an essential ingredient in the semiconductor manufacturing process. In the end, this trade war was not successful because, one, South Korean companies were able to quickly find a replacement, and two, also because the Japanese corporations were able to respond quickly enough to either set up factories in Korea directly or set up factories in other parts of the world and go around the national export control that way. Nevertheless, this export control, this trade war, crossed a very, very important line between South Korea and Japan. The line is that since 1965, when the two countries normalized relationship, there was an implicit agreement, implicit firewall between the history issues and the economic exchanges, where the two countries essentially operated on the implicit understanding that they would not let the history issue impede the economic cooperation between the two countries. And that firewall was very explicitly breached by this trade war when Prime Minister Abe essentially marshaled Japanese companies in service of dealing with historical grievances. So this brings me to my third point. What can we learn from all this? In my view, this really underscores the importance of understanding the leader's ideology and motivation. There are, as Professor Ashizawa noted, there are lots of people in the United States.
I think there's if this isn't touched for like a certain period of time, then it thinks nobody is here, so it automatically brings it back.
The screen is fan of Abe. Let me start with. I think it's important to understand leaders' ideology and motivation. As Professor Ashizawa noted, there are lots of prominent people in the United States that have eulogized Abe Shinzo by saying that he was a champion of free trade and democracy and women's rights. I don't mean to deny that he was a champion of free trade and women's rights and democracy, but I do think that such a praise misunderstands Abe Shinzo a bit. And that's because such praise does not recognize the fact that those were not at least primary concerns for Abe Shinzo. If we understand it based on Abe Shinzo's public writing, his speeches, his autobiography, his primary concern always has been to restore Japan to its former greatness, as it existed in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And to the extent that Abe Shinzo had policies that promoted women's rights, promoted democracy and free trade, those policies were in service of that vision. And when those policies in certain contexts did not service that vision, then it was clear that Abe Shinzo was ready to step away from promoting democracy or women's rights or free trade, as we could see from the fact that there was Abe Shinzo would engage in a trade war to deal with the historical grievance. So I think this insight can be applied beyond just the South Korea-North Korea relations and in areas like women's rights, to say that it's something along the lines of what Professor Ishizawa said. You should correct me if I'm wrong, but when we assess Abe Shinzo's womenomics, is it more about promoting women's rights and gender equality? Or is it more about an idea of Bismarckian conservatism, where female labor is exploited in the service of national greatness? And how would, if Abe Shinzo or some other prime minister, if they were designing women's policy in Japan, where gender equality and women's rights was at the forefront rather than national greatness, how would that policy look different from what had happened? My final point is this. As we're sitting here in Washington, D.C., as most of us Americans, I want to have us all thinking about leaders' motivations and ideology, and and train ourselves to think about them from an internal perspective, as they saw the world, as Abe Shinzo saw his world, rather than projecting our agenda, our thought process, and mapping it onto what Abe Shinzo had done. The current mood in Washington, D.C., our national project as Americans, is addressing the rise of illiberal China. And to that end, many commentators have taken this, in my view, a mental shortcut of saying that Abe Shinzo was a great leader, a great politician, because he rose against, he stood against illiberal China, and everything is secondary to that. I don't think that's true. I think countering China may be an important project, but we have to be, again, very, very cognizant about understanding the leader's motivations and ideology. Because if there's any lesson to be gained from the history of American foreign policy, certainly from the history of America's interaction with Japan, is that the United States has no permanent friends. If we automatically assume that the enemy of an enemy of our enemy is our friend, we a lot of times will come to a very rude surprise. And at any case, it will lead the United States into some unconscionable horrors for which we will be responsible. For example, the way that happened during the Cold War, in which the United States sponsored a great number of right-wing dictatorships around the world because they were our bastards in opposing Communist Russia. That era, in my view, is the reprise of that era, in my view, vis-a-vis China, is a real danger that we face. And Abe's legacy here, I think, is a great time to remind ourselves to not fall into that trap again. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me thank our panelists, and we have about 30 minutes for Q&A. So again, I'm going to take questions from the audience. If I call on you, please first identify yourself, state your name and what your institution is, and then ask your question. Okay, does anybody want to start? Yes.
Hi, my name
We're actually, as I said, the staff is going to be giving you microphones.
Thank you. My name is Alex Malolo. I'm an associate at the Asia Group. This is a question actually for Tobias Harris, because you spoke about domestic policy and Abe's legacy within the third era of economics. And one point that came to mind that I don't recall Abe being terribly focused on in his premiership was digitalization of Japan, which was Suga's main focus and now is kind of more or less Kishida's. Given the news that from yesterday's World Digital Competitiveness Rankings came out and Japan has dropped in ranking again, do you have any comments on Japan's digitalization and the missed opportunity, I think, during Abe's time to focus on that, especially when these rankings started in 2017?
Thanks for that. I think you're certainly right that it did not become a priority really at the senior most level, in more than sort of a hand-waving kind of way until Suga. I mean, Suga really said this to be one of my core initiatives, created an agency to oversee it. You have a cabinet post now, clearly that's something, it's the kind of issue where, the problem sometimes with the third era is that you had a lot of like business school buzzwords that, and you could tell that they were business school buzzwords because they were in katakana rather than some sort of indigenous kanji compound. So it was, Abe was very fond of this kind of stuff. And, key performance indicators, and you look at the growth strategies, and a lot of times, the kind of common complaint about them is that they had neither growth nor strategy because they just had like lots of ideas and no sense of prioritization, no sense of, okay, we're going to really focus on this. That I think that actually might be something a little different, where you do now have his successors have picked like one or two things and they're going to really focus on them, and that's where they're going to look for growth. Abe did not do that. Abe was just like, I'm going to throw a bunch of ideas against the wall. Hopefully some of them will work. We're going to have like a tourism initiative. We're going to try to do venture capital. But there was never, I don't think at any point was there really a real focus on that. Of course, like they had, we want to be an IT superpower and all of that. I think the biggest issue, this was something that was highlighted during the Abe years, I don't think they've done anything really to deal with it, was a shortage of people with the skills to do it. So, they had these sort of big goals about what Japan's going to be. And, METI would produce plans about how we're going to train up workers, but the reality was they kept looking at the numbers like, we're going to have a skills gap. We do not have enough people to do the kind of jobs we say. And that probably is still fundamentally really the biggest problem, that the education infrastructure is not there yet. The education infrastructure is not there yet. I don't think they're importing enough engineers with those kind of skills. All the talk about changing visa programs. But I think that was consistently like this would be kind of one of 1,000 things in a growth strategy. But I don't know if there was ever really a concerted focus on the issue.
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Haruka.
Thank you so much for your presentations. I'm Haruka Sake, graduate students on Asian studies. I have two questions. One is to Professor Ashizawa, and one is for Mr. Funaki. So yeah, my question is a little duplicated what the Mr. Park mentioned that. So first question is like you mentioned that more kind of participation of a woman, Japanese woman into Japanese politics. Maybe there's women's or issues very easy to get into, like women to get into the Japanese politics. So do you think like regarding like comfort women issues between Southern Korea and Japan? I think most Japanese people recognize this problem is not like humanitarian or human rights, women's human rights issue, but only that is just some historical issues. So do you think like more participation of the women into Japanese politics, it could be can encourage to resolve these issues? Yeah, so this is my first question. And the second question is like Mr. Park. So how Japan and South Korea's security policy would be strong or to tie the Asian allies toward China, because it could be achievable through maybe resolution of the historical issues like for women with lower first labor, or that's a security significant goal.
Thank you for the question. So your question is more women in politics, then that would help to solve the comfort women's issues. So that's your question. So I showed those so-called conservative female politicians who are picked up by Prime Minister Abe. Now I'm raising uplifted in the Japanese political system. For instance, the Takaichi Sanae, she's really kind of very strong about against this comfort women's issue. So more women. It would be a little bit hard to say whether that the more women in politics would lead to that more better kind of dealing with the comfort women and potentially the proper settlement of the comfort women's issues. But there's a one kind of the statistic and study always has been done. If the number of the percentage of minority people, be it women or minority group in that particular setting, would go beyond 30% of the overall kind of the population, for which case the diet the Japanese diet case, 30% of the Japanese lawmakers with female lawmakers in the diet, then that would like to bring more kind of visible and then meaning for change for the policy and their actions. Currently it's really kind of, it's still like 12% for the overall diet members. So once the number of female representative kind of pass that threshold, then I would expect that would lead to the more meaningful and more informed conversation about comfort women's issues at the Japanese kind of political kind of stage. And that, but the still kind of a little bit long way to go toward that direction.
Okay, so as to the second question, I see the interplay between the historical issues and the security alliance. I see it potentially playing out in two ways. And one, the more ideal model in my view is something that happened in Europe, where Germany did a great deal to apologize and make amends, such that its natural strength as an economic powerhouse gave it a prominent position within the European Union. And there was no meaningful questions or skepticism about Germany's leadership in that group, along with France and other major powers in the region. And really the European Union, in my view, was made possible because Germany was very proactive about dealing with its history, such that it assuaged its neighbors that its aims were not expansionist anymore. So in an ideal world, I would love to see Japan taking this leadership role. In my view, it is a no-brainer. It costs nothing to apologize. It costs, compared to Japan's economy, it costs pennies to make reparation. So I would love to see Japan taking initiative and leadership in this way. The other way, which I'm afraid, which is we're on track for, is for Japan to leverage this competition with China and Russia to say that the claims that Imperial Japan has been a brutal colonialist power is just a flimsy excuse for these bad actors to make claims today. And in a lot of cases, I see that happening now as to China and Russia. I see that happening quite frequently, even in relation to crimes of imperialism committed against Koreans by essentially lumping the Korean activists for comfort women as Chinese spies, basically, or leftists, socialists who are in cahoots with the communists to make false claims or exaggerated claims against the good Chinese, which in my view is a very dangerous path to take, and ultimately a completely unhealthy path to go down. It's, in my view, the reason why the 2015 Comfort Women Agreement failed, because Tokyo under Abe administration approached it in a transactional way, without considering what the victims were thinking, without pursuing reconciliation, and trying to make this as, you sign this document now and you will shut up forever.
Yes.
Thank you.
Wait a minute, Mike.
Got it. Yeah. Hello, professors, and thank you for the the speech. And I'm Wally, and a graduate student at LA School of International Affairs, studying international development. So I'm more curious about the links. So basically, from a saying that I generated from a Asian Development Bank officer, he said economics is about unleashing fiscal and financial firepower to try to force a virtuous cycle between wages, consumption, and investment. But however, the pandemic has brought the cycle to the end before it had its full potential. So for Japan, can we say that only economic structural reforms or supply side reformations that can revitalize its own economic inventory can provide surging new impetus for its long-term economic growth? And how do you comment on that? Or what is the legacy that can be generated from economics for the future policy reformation for Japan and in other Asian countries? Thank you.
It's a big question. I'll try to.
Thank you so much.
Briefly. No, well, I think you're certainly right. The pandemic. I mean, what you saw. To the first part of the question, I mean, what happened during the Abe years was a sort of partial virtuous cycle where you did see wages go up a little bit, but not quite enough. Corporate profits and corporate cash holdings went up a whole lot more. You had a lot of, I mean, to Abe's credit, I mean, I think he recognized that something had to be done on the income side, and he went to, I think, quite extraordinary lengths to try to raise wages and to get employers to raise wages. To the point that Kate Udman, I think, got quite annoyed by that. And you know, there were times where it was almost like Abe was actually working almost with an tacit alliance with organized labor to try to pressure employers to raise wages. So there was, I mean, there was a concerted push on that front, but they never really cracked the code. I mean, ultimately, I think what it was going to take was something that like taxed companies that refuse to draw down their giant cash holdings. They threatened that from time to time, but it was never actually, I think, a legitimate threat. And that, I mean, it's sort of an example of limiting some of its Abe's power. He was never willing to go far enough to make a difference when it came to confronting corporate demand. And that's maybe, you know, a function of being an LDP leader, that the LDP's relationship with big business in Japan is such that you know, any LDP prime minister is going to have a hard time doing that. I mean, that was the reality. So you did have a number of signs of the economy looking better, and certainly look, you know, the labor market was the tightest it had been in decades. You know, graduating from school, you know, employers, you know, were fighting, you know, had more jobs than they had to fulfill. You know, I think it partly explains why Abe was particularly popular around young for most of his tenure. So I don't want to belittle that, but when you look at also the overall growth figures, I mean, the growth still ended up being pretty anemic for all they ended up doing. So the virtuous cycle did not happen. Whether it's structural reform, you know, Abe, there's this question about how much Abe was doing that. Abe sort of like Koizumi doing neoliberalism. I never thought that. You know, very much. You know, and as I said earlier, this is very much state-led, prime minister's office-led efforts to find new areas for growth. And that meant the government was using a lot of different tools. Some of them subsidies, some tax incentives, some of them just, you know, we're going to jawbone and talk to your business leader to try to get them to shift their investments. But you know, this was very much, we're going to identify sectors where there's going to be where there's opportunities for value-added growth. We're going to throw a lot of political capital and a lot of different efforts at trying to move you know, productive resources into those sectors, and hopefully something. And that, I think, on the whole, is the approach that is successfully also taking. Whether that's going to work, I don't know, but you know, the reality is it's a very fiercely competitive marketplace, you know, globally in a lot of these sectors, and so there's a big fight for market share, and everyone's doing industrial policy in various ways, and so it maybe makes Japan less of an outlier than it might seem.
Thank you, Mr. Harris.
Yeah. Hello, thank you for the presentation. My name is Nick Velez. I'm a Johns Hopkins Science MAIR candidate studying security in Asia and specifically with Japan. I want to ask Mr. Harris and Mr. Park 2 questions if I can. For Mr. Harris, I want to ask with the assassination of Shinzo Abe, revealing the Unification Church controversy and the state funeral contributing to Kishida's low approval ratings now in the, as people call it, the danger zone of below 30%, and Ishinkai and the CDP kind of banding together to attack the LDP. Do you think Abe's legacy will be its responsibility for the LDP once again losing power like it did in '94 and 2009? And for Mr. Park, I want to ask about your thoughts on the sideline meeting with Kishida and President Yoon at the UN General meeting, Assembly meeting, with how kind of one can describe how awkward it was. If you think that can kind of, if it offers more insipid and stagnant rapprochement, or do you think it's a positive sign showing that both sides are very willing to work with each other? Thank you.
Mindful time. I'm going to try to answer that very quickly. It's an interesting premise. I mean, I think that, you know, the reality is.
Thank you.
Mindful of time, I'm going to try to answer that very quickly. It's an interesting premise. I mean, I think that, you know, the reality is that I think it's probably just going to lead to just more political disengagement. I don't even want to say apathy, because it actually, you have to care to be disengaged to some extent. And look, the reality of the Abe years, for all the talk about the elections he won them on low turnout. You know, he won them because, you know, independents were disenchanted by the opposition. They didn't particularly love Abe and the LDP. They stayed home. The LDP machine turned out its voters, and they won big elections over and over. I mean, the number for me that I think is most fascinating is in 2012, the LDP won this big landslide with fewer votes than it got in 2009 when it lost in a big landslide. And that was consistently the story. Election after election, turnout fell, it plummeted. 2012 was a record low. 2014 was 7 points lower than what had been a record low, and it barely recovered in 2017. So you had a lot of disenchantment. It's just as likely you're going to just keep seeing that. That the opposition parties aren't picking up these voter, even LDP supporters aren't happy with this unification church stuff, but they're not flocking to an opposition party. They're becoming we support no party, and that just means just as likely that you'll just keep seeing these low turnout elections. The LDP machine does its job. I mean, we could be a few years away from, I think, some pretty significant changes, but that has less to do with sort of this stuff and more to do with the future of Komeito, and that's a whole different discussion. But you heard it here, keep an eye on that, because I think in a couple of years' time, Komeito supporters are aging. The LDP needs them, or has needed them, and a lot of LDP candidates are dependent on their getting the vote out. And if the LDP can't rely on that, it just changes the map in different ways. Are they going to vote for other parties? It's just something to watch down the road. But for the immediate future, I'm guessing Kishida is going to be fine. I mean, he's got a couple of years till there's a leadership election. I don't think he has to worry yet.
I'll also try to be quick about what you and Kishida meeting augurs. Short answer. No is the short answer. I'll be very quick as to why Prime Minister Kishida just simply does not have a lot of momentum behind him to improve Korea-Japan relations from a domestic standpoint. The unification church scandal is a huge liability, and for him to appear to be more implicated with Korea at this moment is just not the right timing. On the other hand, President Yoon is deeply, deeply unpopular. I think I just saw a poll the other day from Morning Consult of world leaders that he is literally the least popular world leader in the free world with 19% approval rating. He has shown to be deeply inept as in a foreign policy practitioner. So even if he has a good idea, it will be, I don't see him executing it very well, and currently he just faces too many headwinds.
Okay, maybe we have time for one more question. You've had your hand up for a while.
Hi, my name is Terrence Mansour. I'm a non-resident fellow at KI. Thanks for doing this panel. It's been very interesting. Very quickly, I was just wondering what the panel thought about Prime Minister Abe's role or legacy on the question of constitutional revision and the impact of his assassination on that development in Japan. Thank you.
Okay, any takers for that?
You can talk. If you want to.
So Prime Minister Abe, sorry. Yeah, his one of his agenda before he, after he joined, he became the Prime Minister was the change of division of the Japanese constitution, and then he tried, but I think the time he achieved the 2015, the introduction of new security legislation. He and also the people around him can learn. That's probably the most things that they can get at this current kind of political climate in Japan. So so that kind of the heat and then also enthusiasm for the constitutional change. But have been, I think, calmed down since then. And so how this kind of unification church things play out for the constitutional revision kind of discourse, particularly within LDP. I think we have to see how the Prime Minister Kishida, the current Prime Minister Kishida, would kind of take up these issues after he, finally kind of completed this controversial state funeral. And then I have not really been seeing that the Prime Minister Kishida's view on the constitutional revision so far, whether how much he wants to go. And so that probably I should ask Tobias for that.
Very quickly, I mean, I think, what we did see with Abe was, I think he ended up being a lot more of a realist about constitutional revision than maybe had seemed the case at points in his career. I mean, and I think, I think points that Nathan made very well. I mean, that realism in pursuit of national power characterizes a lot of what he did. And when he was in power, there was always a sense of trying to balance these longer goals with the needs to stay in power and to actually continue to wield power. So he was willing to be quite flexible in terms of the amendments he proposed in 2017. They were very different than what the LDP proposed in 2012. This radical, very conservative, sort of wholesale rewrite of the Constitution. Clearly, though, Abe also recognized that to push for amendments and then lose a national referendum that has to be held to approve them would be fatal to the government, and I think he's always careful about that. And I don't think he should be any different on that. The reality is, for the LDP, they are stuck in this situation where they don't want to be in a situation where they push so hard to get amendments to the diet and risk kind of an opposition boycott and risk the public backlash to how they've handled it. That by the time it actually, so you get it through the diet, by the time it goes to the public, there's so much bad feeling about it that the amendments fail. And I think they're very, very careful of that. And so particularly the numbers look like now, I don't think they're moving in any particular hurry to get that done. Much else on the agenda.
Okay, thank you so much. We're about out of time, so please join me in thanking. Fantastic event, fantastic questions. I just would say, please keep your eyes peeled for the Seeger Center. If you're not on our mailing list, get on our mailing list. We have future events that will also deal with Japan and Korea. Also, the GW Institute for Korean Studies, if you're interested in Korea, please get on their mailing list as well. Finally, if you are not in graduate school yet and you're interested in pursuing an MA degree in Asian Studies, you know where they do the best events on Japan and Korea. You know this is the only school in the DC area that has its own Institute for Korean Studies. And you know the school in the DC area with the best Japanese language program and faculty. So thank you all. And again, thank you very much for attending. Thank you.